Chapter 16. Escape from Washington, D.C. David stood over the lumpy sleeping agent, and he thought he heard the fat man mumble something in his sleep, as the fat man's head sank into his neck and made his double chins expand. David studied his face with slight amused interest. "He kind of looks like a toad, doesn't he?" David said to Trace and Brick. He looked over his shoulder to see their responses, then saw Brick was busy putting the unconscious Trace on his shoulder. "Oh yeah, oops," David said. The whole reason the Mexican standoff with the agent ended this way was because Anderson had shot Trace. In the heat of the moment, with the tension as high as it was, David wasn't sure if the bullets the agent fired had been live ammo or tranks. As he watched Brick place Trace on his shoulder, he considered the whole scene and thought that he hadn't heard the banging sound of live ammo, and Brick wouldn't go out of his way to carry a dead man. "Let's hurry and get Ashley and Dee out of their rooms and drop this place like a bad habit," David said to Brick. Brick looked over at David. "Lead the way then. I got the hacker on my shoulder." David looked over at the two other men that had been with the fat agent. The man in the black suit was the one that was in David's room gloating about their capture. Now he laid on the ground bleeding, and David wasn't sure if he was still alive. The other man was the buff agent, Madsen. The side of his head looked like his ear exploded like pulp when Brick's fist collided with it. If he wasn't dead, he would probably wish he was after this. David and Brick made their way towards the second and first doors in the hallway, with the federal officer's badge. David's left hand was literally throbbing with pain, and he did everything he could to avoid moving muscles in it or touching it with anything. As they moved closer to the second door, he thought back on his grand escape. After he got into the ceiling, David feared that at any moment he would hear alarms go off. Certain the federal officer would have returned quickly with the agents from the SDT. But the alarm sounds didn't come. He shuffled through the ceiling in agony. When he broke his left hand to get it through the cuffs, he snapped the bones that made up the palm and back of his hand. Unfortunately, in the process, he had broken at least 4 fingers along with it as he brought his own foot down on them. All in all, he was certainly not using weapons that required 2 hands in the foreseeable future. He crawled along until he reached a section that looked like a different room. He figured he had a 1 in 5 shot that it would be Brick's room, 3 of them being the other members of this job, 1 being Brick, and in the worst case, some room filled with feds. He used his still working right hand that had cuffs dangling from it to move a piece of ceiling. He looked and saw Trace. Trace was cuffed, like how he was, but was leaning forward on the table with his head hanging down. The prototypical posture of a criminal that has been stuck in an interrogation room. It wasn't Brick, but Trace could be useful in finding him, and he had 2 working hands. Plus, getting him free now would save a step in the whole escape process. He whispered out to Trace, "Trace, hey Trace." Trace lifted his head and looked around the room confused. "Look up, dweeb," whispered David. Trace looked up with that confused look on his face. When he saw David, his eyes widened. "Holy fuck, what are you doing?" he asked, forgetting to whisper. "Keep your voice down, Nimrod. I'm getting us out of here. You want a ride or what?" David asked. He hopped down to the room with Trace after Trace let him know he was in there alone. When Trace saw David's left hand, he grimaced. "Aw, hell, man. What happened to you?" David didn't need or want to look down at his mangled and broken left hand now. "It came down to what I wanted more. 2 working hands as a slave in a power plant, or 1 working hand doing whatever the hell I want. The hand will heal in time," David said. He knew he would be asked by the others about his hand, especially Ashley, who he would tell the whole thing to. So he prepared a cool line for the occasion to set the tone for this grand escape. "Fuck, dude. Is that even gonna heal right? It looks really David interrupted Trace before he could continue. "Look, it hurts like hell, and I really don't want to think about the long-term effects right now." David looked around the room, then remembered something he saw in the ceiling. He jumped back onto the table and reached his head up into the ceiling. He found the copper wiring he saw earlier and reached for it. Using the handcuffs attached to his right wrist, he ripped some out and brought it down into Trace's room with him. "Think you can pick that lock with this stuff?" he asked Trace. Trace studied it for a moment. Yeah, hand it here so I can work with it." David was relieved. 1, he couldn't pick locks, and 2, even if he could before his left hand now being useless, meant he couldn't work the wiring into a pick. He watched as Trace took the wiring and wrapped it around itself, making it steadier. Then once it was good enough, he put it into the keyhole on the cuffs. David could tell Trace was only just an average lockpicker, since it took about 3 minutes, which made David nervous. At any time, those agents could show up at his door and find him missing. Then the first cuff clicked and came off Trace's wrist. Both men climbed into the ceiling and began to creep forward to the next room. "How do you know which room Brick is in?" asked Trace. "I don't. I'm just guessing until I find him," David replied. He heard Trace snort and mutter something under his breath, but it was of no use turning this into a classic back and forth with Trace. At the moment, they just needed to keep moving and find him. Depending on his condition, if they could get him up and moving again, they had a decent shot of getting out. They reached the next section that was set up like David's and Trace's. David slowly moved a piece of the ceiling out of the way. Then he saw a giant sleeping man. Brick was tethered to a table in the same way he and Trace had been. Only he was asleep in the chair. His guess was, after they got him in the room and cuffed, they didn't want to risk waking him like the others. A single guard was also stationed in Brick's room. He was standing by the door with a rifle leaning against the wall. Based off how he was standing, he grew tired of watching Brick sleep and decided to relax. David turned back to Trace and in a very light whisper said, "Guard, armed, Brick, asleep." Trace considered all this for a moment, then in a whisper matching David's, said, "We have the jump on him." David considered this, and to his credit, Trace was right. "All right, I go in from here. You move over there so you get the drop right on his damn head." Trace nodded his agreement to the plan and moved into position. They looked each other in the eyes as David counted to 3 on his right hand. Then on 3, he jumped through the opening in the ceiling. He landed right beside the table. Brick was cuffed too, and the guard's eyes lit up with shock when David suddenly appeared standing there. He reached for his gun leaning beside him against the wall. Then Trace fell through the ceiling as his hand gripped the rifle. They both let out a yell as their bodies made contact, and the guard's finger hit the trigger twice, firing off 2 bullets into the ceiling. David raced over to help Trace with the man and reached for the gun with his left hand and stopped himself when the aching pains of trying to open his fingers hit him like a wave of misery. He instead tried to throw a right-handed punch at the guard. It connected, but the handcuffs attached to his wrist also hit Trace in the side of the face. As they wrestled with the guard, Brick began to stir. The sounds of the bullets combined with the back and forth were enough to bring him out of his state of beauty rest. Brick looked over at the 3 men on the ground wrestling, and then at his own hands. He curled his hands into fists and yanked hard in opposite directions. The chain holding the cuffs together started to twist under the force of his pull. The 3 men stopped for a moment to look at the mammoth of a man. The guard's face grew pale with fear, and he began to resist harder. The second yank of his cuffs proved fruitful for Brick as the chain broke, and he stood up moving over to the 3 men on the ground. As he came closer, they stopped struggling with one another. The guard's fear became apparent as he stared at the behemoth in frozen shock. Brick, being ever so tactful, quickly reared his right fist back and plowed it into the guard's face. Just like that, he was done. "Well, we had him on the ropes, but thanks for helping wrap that up, Brick," David said as he patted Brick's arm. "No problem. I imagine if I had woken up without you 2 in here getting out wouldn't have been so opportunistic," Brick said using a word David was shocked he knew. "Look, guys, we might want to think about how the hell we get out of here next. This guard doesn't have a key or anything on him," Trace said, panting from the fight. Brick moved over to the area where the door was. "Why don't one of you grab his gun and ammo? We may need it soon." Then he began to throw his body and elbow into the door much like he had done with the maintenance door. About 10 minutes later, and here they were. The Fed was down, maybe dead, as was one of the SDT agents, and the fat one was sleeping like a tubby toddler on the ground behind them. They got up to the second door, and David placed the ID card on the reader. It lit up green, and he heard the latch unlocked. He opened the door. Inside the room was Ashley. Seeing her alive made David swim in a river of emotion. He didn't have much time to consider what had happened to her after they had been ambushed by the riot squad, and he saw her get bunted with that gun. Her eyes were red clearly from tears. Her hands were wrapped like each of them had been, and the side of her head had some dried blood that came from a cut in her hair, where the butt of the gun had collided with her head. "Ashley," was all David could say as he rushed in. Her eyes shot up from the table. "David, how? What's going on?" she asked in disbelief. Well, David started, then looked behind him as Brick entered with Trace on his shoulder. "Short version is, I threw a brick at the window to get us out of here." She smiled at him as she fought off tears. He knew she was tired of being seen as the crying woman, but in her defense, this had been a very difficult road. "Hey, Brick, can you pick the lock on her cuffs?" "I don't know how, and even if I did," David let his sentence trail off as he just lifted his left hand to show the rest. Brick studied his hand for a moment, then nodded. Ashley's reaction was a bit different. "David, what happened? Did they do that to you?" David looked over at her. I did it to myself. Had to get out somehow." Holding the broken left hand into his own line of sight made the throbbing pain that much worse, so he put it back down. Brick walked over to the table, and instead of using the copper wire to pick the lock on the cuffs, he pulled at the chain to break them like he had done to his own. After they were broken, and Ashley was free, Brick shrugged his shoulders at David like a child would and said, "Can't pick locks." Ashley rushed over to David and hugged him. He held her in tight. It felt good, but they couldn't afford to waste time. "Look, we gotta get D, grab our shit like Trace's laptop and blow this popsicle stand." "This ain't a popsicle stand, Nash," Brick said. David looked at him with his brow creased. "Yeah, Brick, I know. It's just like a figure of speech is all. You know?" David said in reply. Brick looked at him while he reached down to grab Trace again. "No Holmes, I don't know. You know?" Wow, thought David to himself as they made their way to the final room. The guards posted outside the hallway still had not come to check. That was luck. Brick just made a joke. This is proving to be an interesting day. Once they got to the final door, they used the ID card reader again and found D. A repeat of the freeing of Ashley was used to get D out of her cuffs, and Brick handed her the rifle. "There's 2 guards outside the entrance of this area," David said to D, "so you might want to use that when we get there." D looked at David holding the tranq pistol in his right hand. "You decided that you would rather carry the smaller weapon?" she asked. David assumed she was attempting to take a jab at his masculinity for not being the one to wield the rifle. He flashed his hand to show he currently would not be much use with it. Once she saw his hand, her lips tightened up some. "I see. Gotta do what we gotta do, right?" she stated. "That's the motto of the fucking night," David replied. They made their way to the guarded door. The guards on the other side of the door were talking about a football game, and one asked if they should be concerned that they hadn't seen anyone come back through yet. "Nah," said one of the guards. "Those guys were SDT. My guess? They are interrogating the whole group of them. Want to juice them for everything they got. Say you try that new Men Fertility Plus yet?" The other guard replied, "No, I can't say I have. Any good?" "Oh yeah, the missus still isn't as interested, which I can't be too mad about or anything. But when I take it, I am ready to go, boy. We finally tried for the first time in a while about a month ago. We are expecting now, our first baby," the first guard said. "Wow, that's great. After only 7 years of marriage, that's better than typical," the second guard replied. David rolled his eyes. These guys were not high enough up any food chain to be off Chembal, and you could hear it just in the way they talked. David looked over at Brick and D. Ashley was further back due to her not having a weapon. D and David would be the ones on point, as Brick was still the human stretcher for Trace. David and D looked at each other, then took positions based off which guard they would make a move on. The door opened, and the two stopped talking, expecting either the SDT agents or the Fed that led them here to walk past. Instead, David casually walked out into the hallway, then turned around and smiled at the guards. "Hey boys, my legs are a little stiff. Hope you don't mind if I take a lap?" They both stared at him in utter confusion. Then D came out quickly, whipping the butt of the rifle into one guard's face and then the other. David sank a tranq dart in each man as they hit the ground for safe measure. He looked up at D and shrugged. "Told you that would work." She walked by in a huff. Stupid is always rewarded with luck. Then Brick and Ashley came out as well. They moved as silently as they could. Even Brick was trying to be quiet, which was a new look for him. Ashley paused as they stepped out of the detainment section, "We have to find Trace's laptop," she whispered. David realized that she was right, but he also wanted to find his father's pistol. Now that he was reduced to the use of one hand, he would need a weapon he could fire. Although the tranq pistol was effective, a real gun would be more suitable in the event of life or death. "Do we know where they put our stuff?" asked David. Dee rolled her eyes. "Look, I will go and find our shit. Ashley, you are coming with me. Nash, Brick, you two and the sleeping moron go hide in that section, in the cubicle spaces." "Why do you want to take Ashley?" David asked. He knew that probably came off as belly-aching, or maybe he was questioning if she would be of any use. But his real reason behind the question was worry. He knew Ashley was tough, tougher than her appearance led people to believe. But the thought of her slinking away into the building with armed guards without him knowing what was happening to her filled him with territorial worry. Simply put, he didn't want to lose her. "She's smaller than both of you, she follows direction, and she has 2 working hands. We'll be fine," Dee said. David nodded, a little annoyed about the situation. Dee pointed to a corner for Ashley to head over to, and she moved silently and quickly to check out the next section for the duo. Brick took Trace into the office section of cubicles and moved as quietly as he could. Dee looked at David before she followed Ashley to the corner. "Nash, she'll be fine," Dee said to David, emphasizing the she part to him. He nodded his head slowly, looked over at her as she waited for Dee, and then followed Brick into the cubicle section. They waited for about 10 or 15 minutes. It felt like the longest drag of time David had to sit through. It was not helped by the agonizing pain in his hand. If he wasn't careful when moving, he could feel the bones that made up his hand shifting unnaturally around under his skin and muscle tissues, which made him get lightheaded and nauseous. After another 5 more minutes, they heard the slight movement of light footsteps. David poked his head out of the cube he was hiding in to see Dee and Ashley entering the section, looking around for them. He made waving motions that caught Dee's well-trained eyes almost immediately. They rushed over. They found the area where everyone's items had been placed: David's gun, Brick's shotgun, Dee's sniper, and Trace's laptop. Then the building alarm went off. "Fuck!" yelled Dee. They joined David in the little cube to hide with him, and Brick leaned back into the cubicle he and the sleeping Trace had been hiding in. They watched the section's entryway for a moment in fear to see if the guards would come this way. David realized, with a federal building having already been broken into, an alarm going off would no doubt get outside enforcement aid. They had to find a way out quick, or they would be right back in the cells or dead. Also, those agents would be awake, and he doubted they had any interest in talking now. Then a line of running guards passed by the office section's entry. They were running to the detainment section. It was a stroke of luck, but there would be more guards throughout the building. There had to be a way out of this place quick. David used his working right hand to rub his eyes as he dealt with a headache that was no doubt coming from the events and damage he had encountered throughout this night, not to mention the energy-extracting devices that were somewhere in this room. He wanted to escape just to read more about what they were. Then he looked out an office window into the night sky, wishing he knew what they could do. "Oh, God damn it," David said, feeling like a complete buffoon. Dee looked over at him. "What?" "They went to the detainment area. It gives us some time to—" He cut her off. "Look, man. Windows," David said, pointing. Dee looked over, then rolled her eyes with a half-smile on her face. "Putain d'enfer," she said in French. She would tell him later it meant, "fucking hell." They rushed over to the windows and realized they weren't the type that opened. But that wasn't going to be an issue with Brick, who promptly smashed one, then ripped out the middle metal framing section and removed the window pane next to the one he broke. "I would like to get out too," he said when Ashley looked at him with confusion about the second window. They all hopped out, first Dee, followed by Ashley, David, Brick, tossed Trace, and David attempted to pad the landing, and then finally Brick. They moved quickly. The alarms were loud, but the possibility that someone heard them was also very high. They almost jacked one of the Fed cars, but stopped. "Wait," David said. "These things will for sure be traceable, and I think we should get out of here using alleys and stay on our feet." Brick spoke up first. "That means I gotta carry this fucking red-headed moron all the way to the pawn shop." David noted that meant Brick was annoyed with lugging around another human, which he couldn't really blame him for. He wouldn't want to. He's right, Brick. They will be watching roads and stopping anyone within the DC area at this point. We gotta be smart, Dee said. Then she began running towards a shadowy section of the parking lot. The rest followed. It took them 2 total hours and a few close calls, but they made it to their destination. Along the way, Trace had woken up, which almost blew their spot when he nearly yelled out in shock. Had Brick's hand not been faster than Trace's vocal cords, it could have been very compromising. They entered the shop through the back door, like how they left. Old Nex had been sleeping when they entered the building and Dee woke her. She smiled. "Oh, Dee, you're back. How did it go then?" Dee looked over at David. "We got caught, but Nash was slick enough to cause a breakout. We got everything. Trace uploaded all the shit, and we recorded it all too. These Fed pigs are about to be living in a PR nightmare," Dee said. The old woman just smiled and nodded, reminded David of a grandmother-like figure. "That's very nice, dear. Very nice indeed." She looked over at David, who was holding his left hand up slightly, when she realized the damage to his hand. Just as David imagined a grandmother would do, she was immediately concerned. While David understood the concept of this reaction, it was foreign to him, as nobody had ever reacted with such concern and care for David before, aside from Ashley. After a call on her burner phone in 30 minutes, a small man with thick comedic glasses in his 50s arrived. "Dr. Stevens is here. Let's take a look at that hand, David. Hopefully, he can give you something to dull the pain," the old Nex said in a worried granny voice. The doctor had David sit down in a chair and prop his left hand up some so he could study the damage. He poked around it, causing David tear-jerking pains. Ashley stood behind him with her hands on his shoulder as the doctor examined him. Finally, after some time, the little man spoke without looking at David's face. "The damage to your hand is quite extensive. Besides the fact that your index, middle, and ring fingers, as well as your thumb, are all broken in several places. It would seem the bones within the hand itself have been cracked in several places. You will require surgery and steel rods to keep the bones in place as they heal. Even that won't stop severe arthritis from setting in within a decade or so," the little man said to him. David shook his head. "No surgery, not yet. I have stuff to finish, still." This drew the little doctor's attention up to David's eyes. "You understand your hand is in a very critical condition. If left alone, it will not heal properly. Even more so in the worst case, it could lead to amputation," Dr. Stevens said. David felt Ashley's hands tighten some around his shoulder. "David," she said, "this is serious. You need to think about what you are saying." David, without breaking eye contact with the little doctor, replied with a slight fire in his voice. "I will get this surgery after I finish what we started. We are so close." The little man studied his face for a moment, then sighed and closed his eyes. "Well, I can make a cast to wrap up your hand and broken fingers in, but that will only do to keep the bones in relative place. The longer you leave it in that condition, the less likely surgery can be as optimal. You could be looking at a minimally working left hand with slight disfigurement if you go too long that way." David nodded in agreement to the casting of his hand. Dr. Stevens started by giving David a heavy sedative and painkillers. As David passed out, the vision from earlier began to replay in his head again. He saw the bright, big city, with 3 giant versions of PowerPlant buildings, the man holding his arms up to the moon at night, dressed in some extravagant clothes David had never really seen before. He saw the black orb of a PowerPlant pylon, emitting an unstable amount of power. It was pulsing, and 2 hands reached out to grab it. They were his hands. The energy ran through him, telling him to stop, no more. This is wrong. He didn't understand anything about any of it. Even now, it pissed him off not knowing. Then he saw the man again reaching out to the moon. The man lowered his arms and turned to face David. It was his father's face, or at least the face he imagined his father would have based on what little memories of him he had. He looked at David, approaching him in those fancy robes. He stopped right in front of David and said, "Your answers are in the place above." David's eyes snapped open quickly. Although he was still feeling the effects of the painkiller, the dream he had startled him to a heightened alertness. He sat up in the chair he was in when the good doctor put him under. He looked over at his hand and saw the fresh white casting around his hand and ended just above his wrist. Besides his pinky finger, The other 4 had been wrapped up as well. He stood up in the back room alone and felt wobbly as he adjusted his weight on his legs. Whatever drugs Dr. Feelgood used, they were strong. He couldn't even feel his feet, let alone his broken hand. He began to move towards the surplus inventory room further back in the shop. He began to hear voices. As he got closer, he recognized it was Trace and Ashley. "Look, man, I like the guy, really. I do. He saved my ass back there, big time, and that ain't nothing I'm gonna forget. But fuck, dude, he wants to go way above what we were supposed to do. Let's just settle for this. Nobody ever did anything like this before," Trace said. It was obvious they were arguing about David, and if he had to guess further, his desire to hit this power plant called NP1. Ashley responded now. "Trace, it's scary. I know it is. Half of this I wanted to walk away from a dozen times over already. But David's right. This is big. Bigger than anything ever. All the organization ever says is how they want to stick it to the man, or how they want to uncover the truth and show the lies. But here we stand on the possible verge of uncovering every lie, and you want to move to the side and disappear? I want to live, Ash. I want to fucking live, man. We got lucky, way lucky back there. That was with a French shadow assassin and a mutant beast along for the ride. And oh yeah, your boyfriend still had to damn near rip off his own hand just to get to the point where I got shot at. You want to try that with a power plant?" Trace's words were sharp with fear. David could tell it would take more than him or Ashley trying to convince him. Then another voice, a shocking voice in this conversation, spoke up. It was Brick. "It's remote. We got people near that general area. Some or all of us may die, but we can be the ones to show the world something important." That was followed by silence, and David figured it was time to enter the room and have a conversation. He stepped through the door and felt the eyes of the 3 hit him as he walked into the inventory room. It was filled with old dusty junk that even people who chased antiquity wouldn't find of interest. Ashley came over to him as he entered. "How's your hand doing?" she asked with a softness in her voice that somehow made David feel at ease. He looked down at it with a casual dismissal. "Well, I'm right-handed anyways, so it's like not even noticeable or anything. Except I do brush my teeth left-handed, so I guess that's going to suck for a while." She smiled and gave him a slight push in his right shoulder, which he played off, but had to struggle greatly not to trip from. The meds were still heavily affecting his balance. Trace spoke up next. "Look, man, I know you said at the DOE and before the doc put you under that you wanted to hit the NP1 power plant, but we gotta really talk about—" David interrupted Trace before he could finish. It was becoming a thing he did to people a lot now. Interrupting them mid-sentence, he kind of enjoyed it. "That is the plan, Trace. We have the chance to give people something they are almost never offered in this world. Truth," David said. But Trace was not ready to settle just yet. "You don't get it, man. While you took your nap, we dug into the shit that was on those DOE files. You want to know what an energy extraction device is? It's literally every goddamn electrical device that uses power plant-based power sources. They use them to draw the energy from our fucking heads, then send them into some network through the power plants." Trace's words came like a typhoon. Everything using power plant energy? That meant it wasn't clean nuclear power that made things work. It was us. "How is that possible?" David asked. "I mean, if they were just sucking us dry, wouldn't people be dropping left and right?" Ashley shook her head. "No. They make sure to keep several things in place. 1, population must be either very high or highly condensed in areas to help the pull on us. 2, they need us to work, even if it's something as simple as office work or bagging groceries. Working ensures at least minimal brain activity, which helps somehow. The stuff is hard to follow. But the thing is, although all the plants work to be energy wells to send out power that is harvested from us, they also use them as networks that all lead to this NP1 site. It's remote and classified." David pondered this for a moment. "What's at NP1 for them to be sending all that power to it?" he asked. Trace shook his head. "Not something even the DOE makes reference to, which makes me think it's some super advanced weapons, or even like something a special storage unit of energy for the super wealthy." David considered that. Trace may not have been far off with that assessment. "So, we send our next the intel we got at the DOE, as well as the footage along with a message that we are hitting that NP1 site. Look, the truth is, I won't ever do anything else with my life as big as this. Fucking over the major elite asswipes that use us like cattle batteries. I don't know if anyone else here is ever going to do anything bigger than that either. I want you guys to come with me, but if you don't, then I'll set up contacts that will. David knew this was flimsy. He knew almost nothing about this world, and without people like Trace, Brick, and Dee, the latter of whom wasn't even in this room, he knew he would be limited in what he could pull together. I'm in David, you know that, Ashley said. That made his stomach flutter. To have her with him, even though she was about as useless as he was in terms of contacts, meant he wasn't about to face this alone. We all die, hombre. So fuck it, let's hit the cocksuckers in the teeth on the way out, Brick said. David was pleased with the addition of Brick. His methods were extreme, to put it lightly, but extreme was needed. David looked at Trace, whose red hair was unkempt. His facial hair was scruffy and patchy like David's had become, and his nose's bridge had a permanent dent from his first meeting with David. Trace's hard face went soft as he let out a helpless sigh. Well, shit, man. What the fuck ever. I guess we all need to have some type of legacy. Plus, let's be real. You mouth breathers couldn't use a deck to hack into a handheld video game. David smiled at Trace and went over to pat his shoulder in some classic male display of way to go team type crap. But thankfully, Trace stopped him. Just to make sure, pal, do you have any clue where NP1 is? Trace asked. David realized he had no clue. No I don't. I was kind of hoping that was something the tech support nerd found when he hacked into the DOE servers. Trace's face turned into a smile like the one he made the first day he saw David in that parking lot. Oh, the tech support nerd did find out. It's part of the reason I had such a fucking problem with it. Okay, and where's that then? Asked David, starting to get impatient. Oh, just the North fucking Pole, Trace said.